Ooh, did you guys see the results out of California for the re-weigh-in or the weigh-in on the day of the fight for UFC 311? Right, so understand something. California has a rule now. All the way back in 2019, they passed a rule saying if you had regained from the day of the weigh-ins until the day of the fight, if you regain more than, or I think it's 15% or more, back in 2019, they had language that said that they could cancel the whole fight. They have basically since amended it where now they flag you. If you, from the day of the weigh-in to the day of the fight, and they weigh you both days, if you re-weigh in 15% or more, they'll flag you, and then what they're most likely to do is they could cancel the bout, depending on how they feel, but what they're most likely to do is just flag it and say maybe how they feel the next time you compete in that state. They might make you go up a weight class. They're not really hardcore about that either, but they're at least monitoring what fighters are obviously weighing in on weigh-in day, and then they're monitoring how much they weigh the next day, and they're trying to get a sense of who are the biggest weight gainers, who are not, are the ones who are putting on a lot, how healthy are they. They're kind of trying to monitor with better data and better information how much people are putting on, how quickly, and whether or not, in individualized special cases, somebody who competes back in that state at a later date might have to move up. The reality is, as you guys can well imagine, the UFC doesn't go to California every single weekend, right? So it's very possible you could compete in California in January of 2025 and then not compete there again until maybe ever the next year. It's rare that you're going to compete there 2 or 3 times in the same year if you're fighting for the UFC. Obviously, there's going to be some other examples where that's not the case. Why do I bring this all up to say? Well, you guys know the deal, right? There's a lot of concerns around weight cutting. How healthy is it? How much can you lose? And the reality is 15% is probably at the high end of what you should be losing. From what I can gather, most dietitians and experts on these matters say that fighters will lose about 10% of body fat content during approximately an 8-week camp, and then another 10% on fight week. You can go up to 15%. It's over 15%, or I should say 15% or more, where some of the problems begin to emerge. Hence, why California is now measuring what guys weigh on fight day. It's not a secondary weigh-in in the sense of if you don't clear a certain number, they won't allow it, again, with very, very, very rare exception. It's just a way to track the weight. Why do I bring this all up to say? Well, something funny happened along the way. There's actually a few funny things, but the one I want to talk about first is Yuri Prochazka. Yuri Prochazka defeated Jamahall Hill at UFC 311. Now, why is that relevant? Well, they fight in the 205-pound division. So, of course, they have to make, this was a non-title fight, so they would have to have made, you can get 1 pound allowance, 206, or below, basically, on weigh-in day, and then they can gain no more than up to 15% or more, obviously with some allowance there. But they don't want you to be much more than that. Well, why do I bring this up? I'm going to look at some data here. I'll put it on the screen. If you look at Jamahall Hill, he didn't gain a ton. He gained 8% back, basically, from what he weighed in. He weighed in at 205 and a half. He put on 16.3 pounds, weighing in 221.8. That's an 8% gain. That's really not a lot. That's actually well below the threshold. That's pretty good. That's reasonably healthy. That's, again, this is not necessarily the best process for you, but if you're going to do it, that's well within what they consider to be an appropriate range of loss, regain, the whole nine. Okay, but check out his opponent, Yuri Prochazka. Look what he gained. Put it up on the screen here. Of course, he weighed in at 204 and a half, and he only put on 3.7 pounds to be 208.2, which is just regaining 2% of his, basically the weight. Just 2% he put back on. Guys, holy crap. Now, let me have a bit of a admission of error here. Halfway admission of error. I have said previously that I thought him going down to middleweight was a terrible idea, and I still basically think that terrible might be a strong word. I'd say not his best choice, but I don't think you can call it terrible anymore. I don't think that's true. Following Prochazka's second loss to Poatan, he really hit a bit of a crossroads moment, and he came out of that fight saying, what do I need to do to get back to a championship level? And he went through many, many things. To sit in a dark room, and he had, even prior to the second fight, was worried about spells. that either Poatan or people around him might be casting. Just a bunch of nonsense, basically. And then one thing he said after the fight that he was really considering was dropping down to 185. And the reason why I was very much against that remains. Namely, the problem, if you look at him, when you see him on tape, even next to Jamahall Hill or really any other light heavyweight, he doesn't really lack for size. In fact, he must be extremely lean to be coming in with these kinds of numbers because he's still big for the weight class. He is not undersized at 205 even a little bit. When you actually ask what are some of the things holding him back at 205 pounds, can you credibly make the argument that size is the issue? In fact, not only is size not the issue, he's as big and strong as anyone in that division and tends to overpower people to an extent over time. But more than that, he was quicker than Jamahall Hill. He's quicker than a lot of opponents. He's very athletic. He's very fast. He's very explosive. Like, the physical deficiencies that come with someone being in a weight class too big for them, these are not problems that plague Yuri Prochazka at all. The problems, as I've been articulating, that plague him have been of a different variety, namely taking too much damage, being hit a little bit. And if you actually look at his numbers from Saturday, they were still slightly above what his average is in terms of accepting damage. So there's still some things to work on. But I think what you could also say is, in looking at the tape, and we went over this on this channel, he's actually gotten much better. I didn't think he took nearly as many clean shots. There were a lot, of course, where Jamahall Hill was grabbing for the head when Yuri was moving his head as often and as nimbly as he did. That is true. But I didn't think he took as many clean shots. I didn't think he took as many brutal shots. I didn't think he took nearly as much overall damage as he typically does. And a lot of the shots were to the body, and it's hard to know exactly what the impact was. But again, on tape, it looked like he was making some meaningful improvements, both in trying to take less damage and then, in my judgment, turning defense into offense. Again, we went over this already on this channel. If you want to have a look at that video, I'll put it, obviously it's up here, and I'll put it in the description box below. However, I also was operating under the assumption that Yuri was not just at a technical deficiency, but that he would have to kill himself to get to 185. And the second part of that is not really true. If he is weighing in at 204.5, this is actually below championship weight, and is only putting on literally a handful of pounds between that and the day where he is fighting, this tells me he actually could make 185. And it might actually be something that could serve his interests depending. Now, let me say, as I just articulated, to me, the biggest issue he has been, and again, there was a big change on Saturday, but there's still more to do, has been a technical deficiency. He simply gets hit too much. He did not take defense seriously, and I still think he's got a lot to work on there. Going to a different weight class, even if you can manage it without too much of a cost to how you normally are, you're just taking a bigger frame with the exact same problems to a different weight class. They may not materialize in the same way, but a lot of those 185ers are big guys. And if your chin is compromised because A, you take a lot of punishment, and B, now you're cutting weight, so it's not going to be the same even with proper rehydration, or reasonably proper rehydration, you could encounter a different set of problems that are similar but not exactly the same when you move down, even if you're bringing a bigger frame to the whole division. So I'm not telling you that he can't go down there and win fights even if he wasn't improving his skill set. I suspect that he could. I think he could make it. He's mentally tough enough to make it, and it looks like, from just a biological sort of frame standpoint, this is something that is actually quite doable. What I think is actually kind of interesting is if he continues on this improvement streak that he's on and really begins to round some corners about working on his striking, working on his defense, working on being patient, working on setting up offense, all the things you saw, at least to some degree, against Jamahall Hill, if he keeps working on that and then takes that to 185, that's a little different. That might be championship worthy over there. That actually, to me, is really quite interesting. I don't know what's going to happen at 205. Is he going to be able to get another fight against Poatan? What's going to happen between Poatan and Ankalaev? Even if Ankalaev wins, I suspect he's going to have to do it twice if he wants to beat Poatan, because Poatan is such a towering figure, literally and figuratively, over that 205-pound division. That might make it a bit of an interesting place for Yuri Prochazka. And to be clear, he is not, I said it before, I'll say it again, just look at him. He is not outsized at 205 even a little bit. He is perfectly suited in terms of his size for that division, and I think being there confers a lot of advantages. I don't know exactly what he'd be giving up to go down to 185, but assuming it's not too much, although there would be some differences there, what would it do to his cardio? What would it do to his fifth-round ability to compete? What would it do to his chin? These are some relevant questions. He'd be a massive 185er with huge punching power, with dynamic athletic ability. I don't know how he would match up against some of the more interesting and powerful wrestlers in that division. And obviously, Khamzat Chimaev is chomping at the bit to get a chance for the title. We'll see how that goes. Again, if you're taking skill deficiencies from one division to another, they're going to show up there. He's going to be hit down there too. I wonder about his chin, as I've indicated. But there's a lot of interesting possibilities for him at 185 in a way that I simply did not consider before. I simply assumed that because he was so perfectly suited in terms of size and athleticism for 205 pounds, that he would have to destroy himself to get down to 185 if that was even possible. And if that's not the case, that changes the game. I really, 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 really just hope that he continues on the path of improvement, because no matter whether it's 185 or 205, the only real way to get where he wants to go is skill development. But skill development, along with a little bit of weight bullying, that's an interesting prospect. That's an interesting situation. That is something that is very, very different from what I had imagined it to be just a fight ago, 2 fights ago, from what I thought we were going to get with Yuri Prochazka. I thought he was going to not work on his improvements and then try to go 185, which I thought would be way too much for him, and you're just making a bad situation worse. That's not what he did. He stayed at 205. He actually is working on his game, and if he's that light, he might be able to do something with that. It will depend on how everything moves at 205. Will he get another title shot? Will it be against Poatan? If so, when will it all be? These are unknown things. It's really hard to say. But if the door at 205 closes, that door to 185 might be wide open for somebody like that. By the way, if I may, before we go, speaking of all of the weight bully claims, can we take a look at the bottom of this graphic? I'll put it back on the screen here. Islam Makhachev, 155 is the approved weight, 154.5, the championship weight is what he reached. 178 is where he weighed in the following day, which was a gain of about 23.5, a 15% gain of from one day to the next. Now, again, that's right at the limit. But here's what's interesting. If you go to his opponent, Renato Moicano, again, 155, he weighed in at 155. He put back on 181.8, a gain of 26.8 pounds, a 17% increase day over day. Boy, there's a lot of people who have been saying Islam Makhachev is a weight bully. And yes, he's at the California limit, as you can clearly indicate. But I would argue that 15% is about right for a 155er. He's certainly, by that measurement, not the biggest guy doing it. He's not putting the most weight back on. There are a lot of guys who are putting weight like that back on. In fact, if you look at the overall numbers beyond just 155, another teammate of them, Tagir Ulanbekov, putting 17% back on. Peyton Talbot, 17% back on. Merab, by the way, putting 17% back on. Then you go to the blue corner. These were all a little bit lighter, except for the bottom of the screen. Hauni Barcelo, 17. So he and Peyton Talbot putting on a lot of weight back on. Renier de Ritter right at the limit. Umar just past the limit, so that's an interesting one there as well. And then, as I mentioned, Moicano over at 17%. I mean, Islam is hardly the worst offender on this one. So for people who have been saying, oh, he's only doing really well at 155 pounds because he's just bigger than all these guys, he's naturally a 170er, I'm going to submit to you, and you could see in Islam talk about this being 182-ish walking around camp. I know several lightweights bigger than that. 182, and then, of course, in camp about 178, and then getting down to 155 in fight week. That's actually pretty normal. That's actually pretty on par. That's actually about standard for an elite lightweight fighter in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So, interesting. Yuri Prochazka maybe could easily, I don't know, easily is the right word, but could certainly make 185. And all these weight bully claims that go against Islam, and his opponent was much bigger than him. Same day weigh-in, again, it's not binding in that way, but same day weigh-in results coming after the following day. This information captured by California. You're getting some pretty interesting and I think eye-opening results that challenge just a lot of the BS narratives that come out around these guys from people who just simply don't want to accept, in the case of Islam, how good they are, or in the case of Yuri, I don't think he was putting enough pressure on himself to get better and was looking at the weight cut as a bit of a end around to get where he wants. But now, if he gets better and does the dropping of the weight class, sky's the limit for him. Very interesting results. Stay tuned for more.